So welcome today.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Okay, so let's just get started by talking about, there's a number of reasons why I wanted to run this conference. At the time when I proposed it, which was pre-corona, so we've had to postpone it, was because of the chapter I was writing on Mitch Green's work, along with the contour theory, some of which you're going to mention in your keynote lecture for those that are going to watch that. But this does also fit with the work that you did on the arousal theory. So just for those that haven't read that book, Art and Emotion, just tell us what's the arousal theory?
So the arousal theory is the thought that, the simplest thought is that sad music is music that makes you sad.
Yeah.
But then you have to build in a lot of caveats because, of course, there is music that if you listen to it, you'd still not want to describe as sad music, but it doesn't make you sad. So you have to start talking about ideal listeners, ideal perceptual circumstances. It's not really, in the end, sadness that you feel. It's something that might just provoke the thought that the music is sad. So there's all sorts of caveats you have to put into it. But the core thought is the dispositional thought. It was a theory when I started working on it, was universally reviled. But I thought it got a very bad press because it's not altogether different from some perfectly acceptable theories, for example, of colour. So a red ball is a ball which people will experience as red. That's kind of the canonical account of red. So why not sad music is music that people experience as sad? So I thought it was much more defensible than other people thought it was. Whether in the long run it's defensible, I think I probably think that it's not these days.
But it does seem to still be so when I have students that are interested in thinking about this question for themselves, it is the intuitive starting point for many people.
Yeah, and I think it's the thought that aroused emotion plays an important role in our experience of music and is linked to the value of music is something that has come back into fashion. And it's helped, I think, by music psychologists being very interested in the phenomenon of aroused music arousing emotions. Yeah. So I think there's a nice confluence of interests, both from the psychology of music, who are interested in this and are kind of interested in it through the philosophers as well. So
there's this whole, I think that is really interesting, there's this whole kind of like area of discussion that goes on. What is it to be aroused? What is it to be kind of misty-eyed as opposed to, so we're quite clear-cut about what it is not to be, we just call it the dry-eyed kind of experience of the work, and that can be for music or for art, right? So you see the work, you recognise that it's sad, but you don't actually feel any sadness yourself. And that would be kind of one way of thinking about the mindset or the kind of experience you're undergoing. And the other is that there is some sort of you've been moved in some way, you might say more generally. You're misty-eyed, but we're not clear if that's full-blooded emotion or whether that's just some kind of imitative or kind of like simulative state. And there's a whole body of literature that falls in around that, right, as well.
Yeah, that's right. I think that there's a sort of danger of a death by 1,000 cuts with the arousal theory, because from the philosophical side, you have what looks like a really powerful and simple explanation. Sad music is music that arouses sadness in the listener. Yeah. But then you start saying, oh, but it's not really in the listener, and it's not really sadness, and it's not really this and that. Okay. And in the end, each caveat you put in makes the theory weaker. Yeah. And in the end, you might get a defensible theory that's just not interestingly strong, or an interestingly strong theory that's not defensible. Okay. So somewhere between those two, one hopes there is a happy state to be. But
okay, and so of those 1,000 cuts, which is the one that you take to be the most serious? Is it that the emotion ends up in the wrong place, the viewer, not the object? Or?
Yeah, I think that's right. So if it really is an emotion that we're talking about, emotions are felt by sentient creatures, but the content of the experience of emotion in music is of something in the music. So the difficulty is explaining or justifying the claim that there's something in the music by reference to something which is paradigmatically in the listener. And I think that is a problem. It's a problem, but it's somewhere in that area, there's a problem in the dark heart of metaphysics of secondary properties generally, which is, as going back to the colour case, secondary properties are paradigmatically analysed in terms of the experiences of the
they're mind-dependent in some important.
So, but yet we experience them as being out there. Now that's a problem, as I say, in the core of metaphysics. Whether it'll help out the arousal theory in the long run, I think, is unlikely. But sometimes, I might think that even this desperate problem for the arousal theory about the emotion being in the wrong place has something in common with a problem that everybody has to face who's interested in secondary properties. So it might not be a terrible problem for the arousal theory.
Yeah, it's just a problem that every theory has to face. And the arousal theory,
if they are the same problem, I mean, I'm not sure in the end they are the same problem, because I think the arousal theory, the problem is so particular to do with a felt emotion and experienced music in the outside that it might just be a problem that has to be considered on its own. But in as much as it has affinities with the problem of secondary properties, it's not a problem that it's not a problem we need to make the poor thing face on its own. Yeah.
Although I do think there's a kind of, so the temptation to untwist the two and just kind of consider the problem of expressive whatever, music, pictures, film, apart from this notion of arousal, which I understand why people want to do it. They don't want to kind of confuse the two. But it exactly goes back to these things that you talk about in your lecture. What's interesting or significant about it being expressive if it doesn't move us at all? I mean, surely the whole point is that it's bringing together both this kind of perception of the outside world, as it seems to be distinct from you, and something that seems to be very much part of you. And that's part of this kind of rich kind of phenomenology that you get, and one that we want to return to. And whether or not it's a gateway to something and there's nothing further there to be considered isn't really the point. The point is we're compelled enough to put ourselves through that experience a number of times because we clearly are getting something out of it. And the question then for the philosopher is, why? What are we doing? What's going on with the structure of that experience, and how is it different to just looking at a colour or just hearing a sound on its own, where you can, those kind of like elements are completely decoupled or detached?
I think that's right. I mean, I've got increasingly interested in this recently, partly as a result of thinking about today. And I realised that this was something that Malcolm Budd, who taught me as an undergraduate, and I've been sort of in touch with ever since, realised this is something he's been trying to tell me on and off for years and years and years, which is to actually really think about the phenomenon that we're trying to explain, try and get a grasp of the core phenomenon that we're trying to explain. Yeah. Because I think the theories, in the end, because the temptation of theory is to give something that's relatively simple, because it's relatively simple, it's going to be relatively defensible, and it just might not be up to explaining the phenomenon that needs to be explained.
Yeah.
There's a danger there.
Yeah. And so how did this, so when you first came across, so I'm going to take you back to Mitch Green's view now, and this idea of, so Mitch puts forward this idea that that perceptual, are kind of the things we see, the colours, the sounds, have these kind of features or characteristics to them, as do affect, where it's all sitting on kind of the same level, and you can abstract all of these things into some kind of meta adjective category, right? Where you can say, oh, well, they're kind of on these value scales. And so now it just looks like we're descending one level down from this abstract category. All you're doing is you're pinning these kind of particulars, these kind of quale particulars to these abstract categories. How does that sound to you? You've kind of mentioned a bit more about this in your lecture, so it would be good for people to go and listen to the whole thing. But just as a first off idea, how did that strike you when you first came across it? Just sort of neurotypical synesthesia, if you like.
I think in the background to everyone's thinking about this, there's this puzzle, which I do mention in the lecture, about Gombrich's example of ping and pong.
Yeah.
So people have a language which has two words in it, ping and pong. They get shown ice cream and soup. They'll call ice cream ping, soup pong, mouse and elephant, mouse ping, elephant pong, and so on and so forth. And there's pretty reliable agreement on this across everybody. So that's an intriguing thing. How is this going to be explained? Well, there must be kind of natural affinities between sounds and sights and all these different modalities. And, thank goodness that Mitch Green's been off and investigated this and come up with a very powerful account of how this can be, where he shows us, or he argues that there are many different ways in which things can show us how other things are. And he thinks that things in one sense modality can show us things in another sense modality. So a sight can show us how something feels. Yeah. And I think that is very powerful, and it probably does a lot of explanatory work in telling us, in illuminating how we can skip gaily from one sense modality to another sense modality, or from perceptions to emotions.
Yeah.
I think where I'm less convinced is that it can show us the power that those associations have for us. Because I think it's not just that there are associations or that there are natural affinities. I think that we experience those associations as being something, and then it's difficult to know what to say, because you start sort of sounding weird and banging on in the way that people who love music, particularly classical music, start banging on. But you sort of experience it as something as an affinity that is enormously important, that shows us that's the key to the universe, that shows us truths about things.
Yeah.
And if you want to explain that phenomenon, there's thought that these are not just affinities, but they're somehow rationally justified. Rationally is probably not the right word, but that's the one I used in the lecture. They're somehow justified and important and pack a punch. Then I think that we will probably need more than Mitch Green's theory offers us.
Okay. Right. So one of the ways that I think he tries to get, into my mind, that one of the ways that I see him trying to sort of fill that bridge between the kind of mechanistic and the value, if you like, is that he introduces this empathy caveat to his view. And I think that he needs, because he wants to, just as you're saying, flood the kind of state of mind that he's talking about. So here we've got percept A connected in some deep sense through this kind of hierarchy system to percept B. You sense them as being joined together, but that's not going to be enough for what he needs. He needs to flood that sort of experience, that sensory experience in some way, and so he floods it with this notion of empathy. But as I've kind of said on a number of occasions, and I've put this to him as well, that seems like the right direction to be walking in, because then you're getting to the right kind of phenomenology. But it doesn't actually, when you dig into the details and kind of try and work out under the bonnet how that's working, it's not clear what empathy is connecting to or how it gets in the picture. It's just it seems to be the wrong capacity to be invoking. So we do want the kind of result he gets, which is, it's clearly, yes, we agree, it's clearly something to do with the way it sounds and it looks together in this enriched way. But we're not yet understanding how the different structures of those experiences are being combined. And it would be interesting, not just from a mechanistic point of view, to understand that, but as you say, because maybe these are ways of disclosing to us affect and value in the world. That would be interesting, right? That would be interesting.
Yeah. If he could carry it off, that would be incredibly interesting. I agree with you that it would be interesting to really explore how or if empathy can help us out here. I suppose I'm doubly sceptical, because I have my worries about whether, as you say, empathy is the notion that can help us out here. But secondly, for completely independent reasons, I have slight doubts about the notion of empathy as an explanatory notion.
Okay.
Simply because it's very unclear it's often just very unclear what people mean by empathy, and it's a bit like one of those words that people bung around. Imagination is another case where you sort of think, well, given that none of us really know what the imagination is or what empathy is, it's very difficult to know what its explanatory clout is.
Right, okay. It's just like having everyone in a holding pattern over there while you figure out what's going on here. Yeah. And you just think, well, it's got to be up in the air because we've got to keep the whole model levitated, right? But we really don't know if this is the right thing at all, so we just call it something. What is it about the conference that got you interested in the first place? What kind of areas of research do you think might be invigorated by it?
I mean, this is the idea of there being of different. It's not quite different sense modalities, because obviously emotion is not a sense modality, but different. Let's be all sort of 18th century about this. Different parts of the mind operating together, in particularly perceptually, so as to deliver insight, is something that I have been fascinated with since an undergraduate. Okay. Reading some of the things that some of the examples that you and I have talked about, like Kandinsky talking about colour, and his little book concerning the spiritual in art, which is a very strange book, but a lot there which you think, I'd like to be able to explain that. It's clear that non-philosophers or non-professional philosophers or people who don't work in philosophy are happy to make judgments which seem to bring together different sense modalities. That's the kind of data, as the Americans say, that us philosophers should take as something that we should think about and try and explain.
Yeah.
That kind of thing is something that's characterised my work from many, many years ago. So yes, this kind of conference is the kind of thing I'm very much interested in.